I am 76 years old, and I didn't go to my husband's funeral, and I don't regret it. If you're listening to me right now, I want you to know something before I tell you this story. I'm not a bad woman. I'm not a heartless widow, nor am I ungrateful, nor am I crazy, which is what people are saying around town. I'm a woman who, after 48 years of marriage, was left sitting on her living room couch with a cup of lukewarm coffee in her hands while 15 minutes away in the usual church, they buried the man she had shared her inaudible life with. And I didn't cry, and I didn't go. And even today, as I speak to you, I don't feel a hint of regret. My name is Amber. I'm 76 years old, and I haven't been able to sleep well for 3 nights in a row. But it's not sadness that's keeping me awake. It's something like relief. That strange, almost shameful relief you feel when you finally let go of a weight you've been carrying around for so long that you didn't even realize you were carrying it. My kids don't understand. My neighbors whisper in the bakery. My sister-in-law called me a wretch in front of half the town the day of the funeral. But if you stick with me until the end, you'll understand why a woman my age, raised to obey, raised to endure, raised to not make a scene, never decided to stay home the day her husband was buried, because this isn't a story of abuse that you see on the news. There are no blows here, no shouting in front of the neighbors, no bruise to show as proof. This is the story of a golden prison with a swimming pool, a garden, well-trimmed hedges, a German car at the door, and not a single friend she's called in 40 years. Stay with me, because I'm going to tell you everything from the beginning, from the day I met him to the day I decided to stay in my chair there. I met Ricardo in 1972 at the festival in my town when I was barely 22 and he was 30. If you're listening and you remember those years, you'll know what men who consider themselves a good guy were like. Hardworking, serious, and clear-headed. Ricardo was all that and more. He had a construction materials business that he had inherited from his father. He always dressed impeccably. And from the first night we danced, he said something to me that at the time seemed like the most beautiful compliment in the world. With you, I'm never going to let you lack anything. I didn't know it then, but that phrase carried within it the seed of everything that would come later. Because not letting you lack anything also meant, although I didn't know it yet, that you're not getting anything outside of me, not friends, not a job, not a family of your own that wasn't yours. We got married a year and a half later, in a wedding that was the talk of the town for months. I was wearing a dress that had come all the way from Seville. My mother was in tears with emotion. My father kept saying that I had moved up in life, and in a way I had. Ricardo bought a plot of land on the outskirts of the new area and began building what would become our home. A 2-story house with a swimming pool and a huge garden where our 3 children would play years later. From the outs, my life looked like a magazine. The women in the town would look at me with envy when I drove by in my new car. How lucky Amparo is, they would say. And honestly, I thought the same thing for the first few years. I didn't know yet that the luck they envied me had invisible bars. Bars that you don't see in photos, that aren't shown at weddings, that aren't mentioned at Christmas dinners. Bars that only I, inside that house, would learn to recognize one by one over the next 48 years. The first barriers came disguised as affection, and that's the hardest thing to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. 6 months into my marriage, my friend Encarna, with whom I had grown up, invited me out for coffee one Saturday. I told Ricardo as naturally as I could, and he replied, without raising his voice or making a single abrupt gesture, "Why do you need to meet up with Encarna when you have me? I'll keep you company your whole life. She probably only wants you to gossip about what we have." And that, 23 years old, eager to please him with my head full of what my mother had taught me about being a good wife, I canceled the coffee. I told Encarna that I couldn't, without further explanation. She insisted once, twice, and the third time she stopped insisting. Just like that, without arguments, without fights, without a single shout, my circle of friends began to disappear, one by one, with the same phrase repeated 1,000 different ways, repeated 1,000. Why do you need anyone else when you have me? If you're listening to me and have experienced something similar, you'll know that this does feel like abuse at first. It feels like exaggerated love. It feels like you're so important to someone that they can't stand to share you. It took me years, many years, to understand that true love doesn't isolate you, it accompanies you without confining you. Over the months, more similar habits began to appear. Ricardo began to decide what clothes looked best on me, what hairstyle suited me, and what tone of voice I should use to speak to his partners when they came over for dinner. He never insulted me. He never raised his hand to me. Little by little, he simply made decisions for me until one day I realized that I hadn't made a single decision of my own for months, not even about which curtains to put in my own kitchen. And I'll tell you about what happened next in the next section, because that's when the house began to become something different for me. Our first child, Manuel, was born in 1975, then came Cristina, and 5 years later, little Alvaro. With each pregnancy, Ricardo found a new reason for me to leave things behind. First, I quit my administrative job at the town notary office to take good care of the child. After that, I quit the sewing classes I had started taking on Tuesdays because the children need you more than a sewing machine does. Each resignation seemed reasonable at the time. Each resignation, looked at separately, made sense. It was only when I looked at them all together that I understood many years later that they formed a staircase that led directly down to total isolation. The house, in the meantime, grew in luxury. Ricardo expanded the chalet, put in the swimming pool he had always dreamed of, hired a gardener for the English garden that he liked to show off to visitors, and the visitors, of course, were always his own, his partners, his cousins, his lifelong friends. I poured the wine, smiled, cleared the plates, and when one of his partner's wives suggested meeting me for a drink someday, Ricardo always found a way to make sure it never happened. A last-minute commitment, a headache he made up for me in front of everyone, a look that I already knew how to read, and that meant don't even think about it. If you're listening, I want you to understand something important. My prison had a heated swimming pool. My prison had a Mercedes parked at the door. My prison had jewelry that Ricardo gave me on every anniversary in front of the entire family so that everyone could see what a great husband he was. And I smiled in the photos. With the new ring wallet side, I knew that the same man who gave me diamonds was the same one who had given me diamonds the week before. He had forbidden me to go to the doctor alone because that's why I take you. You don't need to go with anyone else. People outside saw a perfect life. Inside, I already knew that something was slowly dying, and what happened to my mother when she got sick completely opened my eyes. In 1908, my mother got a heart disease, and that was, without Ricardo knowing it, the first moment when I began to see clearly the classroom in which I lived. My mother lived 40 minutes away in the neighboring town, and when my sister called me crying to tell me that she had been admitted to the hospital, I ran to get the car keys, trembling with a heavy heart. Ricardo took them from my hands with a calmness that still makes my blood run cold when I remember it. I'll take you. You're not going to drive alone on the road when you're so nervous. You're going to have an accident. Sona, be careful. Sona, again, my love. But when we got to the hospital, Ricardo stayed in the waiting room. And every 15 minutes he would go into my mother's room to see how everything was going and to actually check how long I had been in there. As my sister and I would say, whether I was crying too much or too little for his liking. My mother was hospitalized for 9 days. I was only able to sleep with her for 2 nights because Ricardo insisted that the children needed me at home, although my mother-in-law, who lived with us at the time, could perfectly take care of them, as in fact, she did those 2 nights without any problem. When my mother now recovered, asked me one day, looking me straight in the eye, Amparo, are you happy with that man? I answered yes very quickly, almost without thinking, with the same automaticity with which I had been answering that question to anyone who asked me for 10 years. But that night, back in my villa with a swimming pool, looking out my bedroom window at a perfectly tended garden that I barely stepped in, I understood something that would take me many years to dare to admit out loud. I had spent an entire decade living the life that Ricardo had designed for me, not the life that I would have chosen for myself. And what I discovered 3 years later in a drawer that I was never supposed to open confirmed everything. In 1991, while looking for some bank papers, I opened the drawer of Ricardo's desk in his office, an office that I almost never went into because he preferred to handle the serious matters of the house himself. And there, among bills and contracts, I found a folder with my name handwritten on the cover, Amparo. Inside were clippings from job ads that I had talked about excitedly over dinner years ago, marked with a red marker and with his notes next to them. No way. I won't even mention this to him. There was also a list in his handwriting titled Amparo's Friends with the names of women I barely remembered anymore, and next to each name words like bad influence, wants me to work, gossip, step aside, got my blood running. It wasn't my paranoia. These weren't the imaginations of a sensitive woman, like he had been hinting at for 20 years. It was a plan, a conscious, written, organized plan to empty me of everything that wasn't him. I closed that drawer with trembling hands and said nothing that night. Why? Who was I going to tell? If all the people I could have told had already disappeared from my life, crossed out one by one on that list in neat handwriting and red ink, If you're listening to me right now and this sounds familiar from your life or the life of someone you know, I want to tell you something that I would have liked to hear. So when someone needs to control even your list of friends, it's not love that they feel for you. It's fear of losing control over you. It took me a long, long time to find the strength to act on what I already knew. And what happened with my daughter Christina years later was what finally began to change everything. Christina got married in 1998 and went in the capital with her husband. She was the first of my children to leave home. And she was also the first person in my entire adult life who dared to tell me out loud what was happening. She came to spend a few days with us in 2003, already with her first child, my first grandchild, And one afternoon, while Ricardo was at the store, he told me something that still pierces my heart when I remember it, 23 years later. Mom, do you realize that Dad treats you like you're his property? I remained silent, not knowing what to say, because deep down I'd known it for half my life and denied it to myself for a lifetime. Christina continued, you never go out without him. You never have your own money. It all goes through him. I've never seen you make a decision without first looking at him to see if he thinks it's okay. Mom, that's not normal. That's not how a marriage should be. I told her she was exaggerating. I told her that her father was a man from another generation, that this was how marriages had always been in our time, that she didn't understand because she had grown up in another time. But that night I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned in bed while Ricardo slept next to me, breathing calmly as if he had no doubt that everything in his life was exactly as it should be. Christina left 2 days later, but before I left, I was left a card with the phone number of a psychologist in the capital, in case you ever want to talk to someone, Mom, without anyone else knowing. I kept that card in the lining of my winter bag, the one Ricardo never used or checked, and it sat there for almost 10 years, waiting for the day when I would finally muster the courage to dial that number. That day came, although it took longer than I would have liked, and when it did, everything changed. In 2013, at the age of 63, I finally dialed the number on the card that Christina had given me a decade earlier. I did it on a Tuesday morning, taking advantage of the fact that Ricardo had gone into the city to a meeting with suppliers, my heart beating so loudly that I was afraid it would be heard over the phone. The psychologist's name was Marisa, and the first question she asked me, after listening to my rushed, nervous story for 5 minutes, was this: Amparo, how many times has your husband hit you in 40 years? I answered her with total sincerity that not once had Ricardo ever laid a hand on me, and Marisa told me something that changed my entire life. Abuse doesn't need blows to destroy a person. What you're describing to me, Amparo, is psychological abuse that has been going on for decades and is just as serious, if not more so, than many physical abuses, because it doesn't leave any marks that can be shown, but it leaves a person empty inside. I started going to therapy with Marisa once a month, always making up excuses to go out alone, whether it was a medical checkup, a bank checkup, a visit to my sister. Ricardo, oddly enough, didn't have any problems with those specific outings because he considered them serious obligations, not whims like meeting friends for coffee. And in those sessions, little by little, I began to name things that I had been feeling my whole life without knowing what to call them: control, isolation, nullification, forced dependency. Marisa never told me that I had to leave Ricardo. She never pushed me to do anything. She simply asked me a question in one of those sessions that stuck with me forever. Amparo, if your children lived exactly the same life as you, what would you tell them? And there, for the first time in 41 years of marriage, I allowed myself to cry for myself, not for my mother, not for my children, but for the 22-year-old Amparo who one day danced in a bergamot without knowing what awaited her. The following years, between 2013 and 2020, were slow awakening, almost but painful because of how slowly it happened. With Marisa's help, I began very carefully to recover small pieces of my life. I gradually reconnected with Encarna, that friend from my youth whom I hadn't seen for 48 years. I found her thanks to Christina on a social network, and we both cried on the phone the first time we spoke in so long. I also began to save, without Ricardo knowing, small amounts of money from the allowance he gave me for the house in an account that I opened in my name at a different bank than his, using my daughter Christina's home address as the mailing address. It wasn't a lot of money each month, but to me, it represented something enormous. For the first time in decades, I had something that was mine alone, that no one else controlled, that no one else could cross off a list in red ink. Ricardo, meanwhile, was exactly the same, affectionate, in his own way, generous with expensive gifts and absolutely convinced that he was the best husband in the world. He never suspected a thing about my sessions with Marisa, or my secret account, or my increasingly frequent calls with Encarna. He continued to decide what clothes looked good on me. He continued to comment in front of visitors how lucky I was to have a husband like him, and I continued to smile with a smile that was no longer his mission, but a strategy, because at that point, at 70 years old, he was no longer looking to escape us. Suddenly, I had understood, thanks to Marisa, that after 47 years together, with my health no longer what it had been, with a whole life built around that man, my liberation was not going to be dramatic or cinematic. It was going to be silent. It was going to be patient, and it would come, although I did not know it yet. So the same day that Ricardo left this world, what happened when he was diagnosed with disease in 2022 was the beginning of the end of my imprisonment. In January 2022, Ricardo was diagnosed with advanced pancreatic cancer. I remember perfectly the day we left the oncologist's office. At 79 years old, he walked upright, proud, repeating that this is not going to kill him. While I was next to him, I felt something that I could not name for weeks, and that only much later, talking to Marisa, did I understand that it was a strange mix of fear and, to my own shame, a relief that I did not even dare to fully think about. The next 2 years were hard. I cared for Ricardo with the same dedication with which I had done everything in that house for half a century. I accompanied him to each chemotherapy session. I prepared each special meal that the doctor recommended. I slept many nights in an armchair next to his bed when the pain would not let him rest. And here I want to pause for a moment, because I know that many people upon hearing this will think, how can someone care like this for a man who abused them throughout their lives? The answer is that affection and resentment can coexist in the same person at the same time for years. I cared for him because it was my way of being, not because I had forgotten or forgiven anything. During his illness, something strange happened. Ricardo, weak, dependent, and needing me more than ever before in 49 years of marriage, began to act softer, almost tender. He'd tell me he didn't want to be without you. Amparo has always been my support. And part of me, the one that at 74 years old still wanted his recognition, was moved by those words. But another part, the part that Marie had helped build during almost 10 years of therapy, heard those same words and thought, just as you needed to control me when you were strong, now you need me to take care of you because you are weak, The center of everything has always been you. In March 2024, 2 months before he died, Ricardo had a moment of strange lucidity, almost as if he sensed the end, and he told me something that will stick with me forever, and that I will tell you about in the next section, because it was the last great sign of who he had truly been during all those years. That afternoon in March, Ricardo, already very weak, asked me to sit next to in bed. His eyes were shining. I don't know if it was from fever or from an emotion that I had hardly ever seen him show in 49 years. He took my hand and said, Amparo, if I was ever hard on you, it's because I wanted you all to myself. I could never stand the idea of sharing you with anyone, not your friends, not your family, not even a job. You were mine from the first dance, and I wanted you to remain mine alone until the end. He said it with a soft, almost proud smile, as if he were giving me the most romantic confession in the world. And in that moment, at the age of 74, I understood with absolute low clarity something that Marisa had been trying to get me to accept completely for 10 years. Ricardo never saw anything wrong with what he had done. Not even at the end of his life, not even in the face of death, was he able to see that isolating, controlling, and emptying me for almost half a century was not proof of love, but a form of possession. I didn't answer him at that moment. I simply squeezed his hand, because he was still the father of my children, the man with whom I had shared my entire life, and because at that moment of agony, it was not the time to discuss feminism or patterns of emotional control. But that night, alone in my room, I called Marisa, who was now retired, but who continued to answer my calls as a friend after so many years. And I told her word for word what Ricardo had told me. She was silent for a moment, and then she told me something that would be the key to what happened next. Amparo, that man just confessed to you on his deathbed that he kept you a prisoner on purpose for 49 years. And he didn't even realize that that's exactly what he had done. Nash, you don't owe him anything else. Ricardo died a few weeks later on May 2, 2024, surrounded by his children, his grandchildren, and me, who held his hand until the last minute. But what I decided to do 3 days later, on the day of the funeral, was the first decision that was entirely mine, made without asking anyone's permission in 49 years. The morning of the funeral dawned bright, an almost offensive blue for what was supposed to be a day of mourning. My children dressed in black upstairs. My sister-in-law arrived 2 hours early to help with the preparations, which really meant overseeing that everything was done as Ricardo would have wanted, even in death. And as I sat on the edge of my bed with the black dress already chosen hanging on the closet door, I suddenly felt with a clarity that surprised even myself that I couldn't do it, that I wasn't going to. It wasn't an outburst of rage. It wasn't a nervous breakdown. It was rather the first completely calm, completely my own decision of my entire adult life. I went down to the living room in my dressing gown and told Manuel, I'm not going to the funeral. He stared at me as if I had spoken to him in another language. Mom, how can you not go? He's your husband. You've been married for 50 years. People are going to talk. And for the first time in decades, I answered her with something that I didn't even know I had inside. Let them talk. I've spent 49 years doing what was expected of me. Today, I'm going to do what I need to do, which is stay here at home in peace. My sister-in-law flew into a rage, calling me heartless in front of my own children. She told me that Ricardo deserved for him to be there and what the people of the town would think. Christina, my daughter, the one who had opened my eyes for the first time years before, came up to me, took my hands and said in a low voice, just for me, Mom, if you need to stay, stay. You've done enough. She was the first person in my entire family who put my well-being above what had to be done. My children went to the funeral. I stayed home with Encarna, my lifelong friend, the one Ricardo had taken away from me 47 years ago, and who now, at the most important moment of my recent life, was by my side again, as if time had not passed between us. And while my husband was being buried 15 minutes away, Encarna and I sat on the porch in front of the pool that for decades had been the backdrop for my prison. And for the first time in a long time, I truly laughed, a hearty laugh, unguarded, without asking anyone's permission. Several months have passed since the funeral, and I want to tell you, if you're still listening, what my life is like now that I've just earned 76. I sold the building materials business to a partner of Ricardo's business that was already legally mine, although for 49 years, I was never allowed to have any say in it. With part of that money and what I had saved in secret for years in my hidden account, I did something I never imagined I would do at my age. I signed Encarna and me up for a painting course at the Centro Cultural del Pueblo on Tuesday afternoons, the same afternoon that more than 50 years ago, Ricardo forbade me from having coffee with her for the first time. I still live in the chalet, although I've changed a few things. I've taken down the curtains that he chose and put up the ones that I really like. Some bright yellow ones that Ricardo would have considered vulgar. I've invited my neighbors to have coffee in my own garden, something that had never happened in that house in 49 years. My sister-in-law stopped speaking to me, and I confess it keeps me up not. Over time, my children have begun to understand my life better. The decision not to go to the funeral, especially after I told them some of the things I experienced during all those years. At first, Manuel had a harder time accepting it, but Christina, who was always the one who saw the most, has been my greatest support during these months. The little Alvaro is still processing many things, and I respect his time as I would have liked someone to respect mine half a century ago. Marisa, my now retired psychologist, still has coffee with me once a month, not as a therapist anymore, but as a friend. And recently, while we were chatting on my porch next to the pool, which I no longer feel like a cage, but simply like my pool, I told her something that sums up, I think, all these months. Marisa, for the first time in my life, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And instead of scaring me, it makes me feel nicely curious. He smiled and told me that phrase coming from me was proof that I had finally gotten out of real prison, not just out of the house. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you. Heartfelt thanks for listening to my story to the end. I haven't told you this so that you feel sorry for me, or so that you judge Ricardo, who is no longer here to defend himself or continue explaining himself. I've told you this because I know, from the messages you've left me in other similar videos, that there are many women of my generation and younger generations living right now in a golden prison similar to mine, with no bruises to show for it, no friends, no money of their own, no decisions of their own, convinced that since there is no physical violence, there is no real abuse. It took me 49 years to find the words to describe what was happening to me. It took me 49 years to understand that a cage can have a heated swimming pool and a garden with perfect hedges and still be a cage. And it took me 49 years to give myself permission to make a decision that was completely mine. Not to go to the funeral of the man who, in his sincere and mistaken way, wanted me all to himself for my entire life. I don't know if what I did was right in the eyes of everyone. I know that my loved ones were okay, and at 76 years old, after everything I've been through, I've learned that in the end, that's all that really matters. And now I'm asking you, if you're listening, do you think a woman has the right to not go to someone's funeral without ever raising a hand? Did she rob them of 49 years of freedom instead? Leave me your answer in the comments. I'd love to read it. And if this story has touched you, and you know a woman who currently lives in a prison similar to mine, even though it doesn't have bars or locks, share it with her. Sometimes all someone needs to start opening their eyes is to hear that another woman before her dared to do it. Thank you for joining me this far. See you in the next video.